A suitcase hit the pavement. The handle snapped clean off, separated from the body of the bag, like something that had been waiting to break and finally found its moment. Clothes spilled across the sidewalk. A blouse, a pair of slacks, undergarments that should never have seen daylight, let alone a public street. A woman dropped to her knees outside a Greyhound station in a small Appalachian town and began gathering her things with hands that would not stop shaking. People walked past her, not around her, past her. Their eyes moved over her the way eyes move over a crack in the sidewalk or a stain on a wall. Something you register without seeing. Something that doesn't require you to stop or bend down or change direction. She was 62 years old. 4 weeks ago, she had a home, a kitchen, a bed she'd slept in for 35 years, a front door that clicked shut with a particular sound she could still hear if she closed her eyes, a soft clap of the latch followed by the faint whoosh of the weather stripping she'd installed herself. Her name was Miriam Dalton, and if you had seen her that morning kneeling on concrete, stuffing a wrinkled blouse back into a broken suitcase, you would have walked past her too. That's the truth of it. She looked like nobody. She looked like nothing. But what Mary found 6 days later at the end of a dirt path in the woods outside a town most people had never heard of changed everything. Not just for her, for those who thought they'd buried that cabin's secrets forever. Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand how a woman who spent 35 years building a life ended up on her knees outside a bus station, you need to understand a few things about Mary Dalton. Not her whole history, not where she grew up or what her childhood was like. None of that matters right now. What matters is this. For 3.5 decades, Mary was the kind of woman who held everything together without anyone noticing she was doing it. Her husband, Robert Robb, to everyone who knew him, ran a small printing business in the town of Hardin Creek, West Virginia. It wasn't a big operation. 3 employees at its peak. One press that broke down every other month and a front office that smelled like ink and old paper. But it put food on the table, it kept a roof over their heads, and it gave Rob the kind of quiet pride that came from owning something with his name on the sign out front. Mary was the one who actually made it work. She managed the books when the accountant quit and Rob couldn't afford to hire another one. She answered the phone when clients called, writing down orders in a notebook she kept in the top drawer of the kitchen counter because there was no desk for her at the shop. She packed school lunches for their 2 children, Neil and Grace, at 5 in the morning before walking to the shop to open up because Rob liked to sleep until 7. She painted the front room of their house twice because the first time the color wasn't right and Rob didn't want to pay someone to redo it. She hosted his family during holidays, cooked for 12, smiled through the noise, cleaned up after everyone left, and never once asked for help. Not because she didn't need it, because she'd learned early on that asking didn't change anything. She was also the one who fixed things. When the kitchen faucet started leaking at 2 in the morning, Mary watched a YouTube video Grace had shown her how to got a wrench from the garage and fixed it herself while Rob slept. When the weather stripping on the front door wore out and Rob said they didn't need it, she drove to the hardware store, bought the material, and installed it on a Saturday afternoon. She could read a balance sheet better than Rob could, and Rob knew it, which is why he never said it out loud. These weren't the skills of a woman who just endured. These were the skills of a woman who solved problems quietly without recognition because the problems needed solving and no one else was going to do it. And believe me, Mary wasn't a saint. She wasn't some kind of suffering angel who never complained. She complained plenty. She told Rob when she was tired. She told him when she thought he was being careless with money. She told him when his brother Victor came around asking for loans he'd never repay. But she said all of that behind closed doors in the kitchen after the kids were in bed, because that's what women of her generation did. They fought their battles quietly in small rooms with no audience. And then they woke up the next morning and did it all over again. For a long time, that life worked. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was hers. She knew the butcher by name. She knew which neighbor's dog barked at 3 in the morning and which one barked at 5. She knew the exact spot on the kitchen counter where the tile was cracked, and you had to be careful setting down a glass. She knew what Rob wanted for dinner on Thursdays, which was always meatloaf with mashed potatoes. And she knew that he'd fall asleep in front of the television by 9, and she'd have to wake him up and guide him to bed. 35 years of knowing things like that. 35 years of being rooted in one place, in one life, in one routine that never changed. Then Rob died. It happened on a Tuesday. He'd been complaining about chest pains for 2 days, but he didn't want to go to the doctor because he said it was just gas. That's what he always said. Everything was gas. A headache was gas. A sore back was gas. Mary had told him to go. She told him twice. She'd even called the clinic and made an appointment for him. He canceled it. He waved her off and said he'd go next week. Next week came 2 days early. On Tuesday morning, Rob went to the shop, sat down at his desk, and his heart stopped. Just like that, no warning, no dramatic collapse. The man who'd been next to her every single day for 35 years was gone between one breath and the next. An employee named Gary found him slumped over a stack of invoices. By the time Mary got to the hospital, there was nothing left to do but paperwork. They handed her a form. She signed it. They handed her his watch and his wallet. She took them. They asked if she had questions. She didn't. The funeral happened 3 days later. Rob's brother Victor drove down from the city with his wife Sandra and their 2 grown sons. Everyone wore dark suits. Everyone brought food. Everyone said the right things. He was a good man. He's at peace now. Be strong, Mary. Nobody said the thing that was actually true, which was that Rob had been a decent man who'd made some bad decisions with money and left his wife in a situation she didn't yet understand. Mary moved through the funeral like she was watching herself from across the room. She thanked people she barely knew. She accepted condolences from neighbors who'd never spoken to her in 30 years. She poured tea for Victor's wife, Sandra, even though Sandra had never once poured tea for her. That's who Mary was. Even in the worst moment of her life, she poured the tea. She arranged the snacks on plates. She made sure there were enough chairs, because if she stopped moving, she'd have to feel what was happening, and she wasn't ready for that. The trouble started 11 days after the funeral. Mary was sitting at the kitchen table going through Rob's papers. She had a system, bills in one pile, bank statements in another, insurance documents in a third. The mess was bigger than she'd expected. Rob had not been organized. There were envelopes stuffed with receipts handwritten "I owe us," and at least 2 credit card statements she'd never seen before. That's when Victor walked in. He didn't knock. He sat down across from her and put a manila folder on the table. Inside was a copy of the deed to the house. Mary looked at it and felt something cold move through her chest. The house was not in her name. It had never been in her name. It was registered to the Dalton Family Trust, a legal structure Rob's father had set up decades ago to keep property within the family and avoid certain taxes. Rob had told Mary the house was theirs. He'd told her that dozens of times over the years. "This is our house, Mary." But on paper, the house belonged to the trust, and the trust was controlled by the eldest surviving male in the family. That was Victor. Victor wasn't a cruel man. Not exactly. He was worse than cruel. He was practical. He was the kind of man who could look you in the eye and deliver devastating news in a calm, reasonable voice and genuinely believe he was being helpful. He sat across from Mary with his hands folded and explained that the house needed to be sold. The printing business had debts. Rob had taken loans Mary didn't know about, 3 of them, 2 from the bank and 1 from a private lender who was already calling. The equipment at the shop was outdated and nearly worthless. The clients had already started going elsewhere. The only asset of real value was the house, and it needed to be liquidated to settle the family's obligations. He said the family's obligations in a tone that sounded rehearsed, polished, like something he had practiced on the drive over. Mary asked him what she was supposed to do, where she was supposed to go. Victor said she could stay with Neil, but Neil was living 4 hours away in Northern Virginia in a 2-bedroom apartment with his wife Donna and their newborn baby. Mary hadn't even told Neil about the house yet. She'd been trying to figure it out herself first, trying to protect her son from the same helplessness she was feeling. After Victor left, Mary's phone rang. It was Sandra, Victor's wife. Sandra didn't call to comfort her. She called to say one sentence delivered in a voice that was tight and rushed as if she was speaking before she could talk herself out of it. Mary, I know this is hard, but Victor is under pressure too. He has debts of his own that he doesn't want to talk about. Then she hung up, quick like a person who had just betrayed a confidence and needed to end the call before the guilt set in. Mary sat at the kitchen table and stared at the phone. The 3rd loan, the one she couldn't trace. Rob hadn't borrowed that money for the business. He'd borrowed it for Victor. And now Victor was selling her house to cover a debt that existed because of him. She called a lawyer the next morning. The lawyer was sympathetic. He listened to everything, took notes, and then told her what she already knew but didn't want to hear. The trust document was clear. The house was not hers. She could contest it in court, but it would take years and cost money she didn't have. Victor had already filed papers to dissolve the trust and sell the property. He'd been moving fast, faster than grief. The lawyer charged her $200 for this information, and she paid it because she didn't know what else to do. Mary spent the next 2 weeks on the phone. She called Neil. He was upset, but helpless. Working 12-hour days at a software company, barely keeping up with his own rent. He said she could come stay with them. But the strain in his voice was obvious. That night, Neil called back. Late. His voice was low, the kind of low that meant he was calling from somewhere Donna couldn't hear. He said, Mom, Donna says we can make it work, but I can see it in her face. She's already counting the days. He didn't cry. He just went quiet, the silence of a man caught between 2 people he loved with no way to save either of them. Mary said, You don't have to explain. I understand. She hung up and sat in the dark kitchen alone. She called Grace, her daughter, who lived in London. Grace cried on the phone and promised to send money. The money came. A few $100s. Mary was grateful, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for a legal fight or a security deposit on an apartment or anything that resembled a solution. She called old friends. Most expressed sympathy and offered nothing concrete. One said she'd ask around. Another said Mary could stay for a few days if she needed to. A few days. That was the maximum anyone was willing to commit. Mary didn't blame them. She understood. Nobody wants to be the person who takes in the widow. It starts as a few days and it never ends. She called the local Women's Help Center, which gave her a list of shelters and a phone number for legal aid that rang and nobody answered. She called the county housing office and was told there was a waiting list 3 years long. She called Victor one more time and asked if there was any other way. He said no. He said the buyer was already interested and the papers were being drawn up. He said he was sorry. He said it like he meant it. Maybe he did. 62 days after Rob died, Mary walked out of the house she'd lived in for 35 years. She carried one suitcase. She'd packed it carefully the night before, sitting on the bedroom floor, choosing what to bring from an entire life. Clothes, her reading glasses, a photo album with pictures of the children growing up, her marriage certificate, a small bronze angel figurine her mother had given her on her wedding day, a bar of soap, a comb, her notebook with the order numbers from the printing shop because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Before she walked out the front door, she stopped in the kitchen. She put her hand on the cracked tile on the counter, the one she'd always been careful about when setting down a glass. She didn't say anything. She just held her hand there for 5 seconds. Then she walked out. The locksmith Victor had sent arrived while Miri was still packing. He waited outside, smoking, checking his phone. He wouldn't look at her. When she came out with her suitcase, he went in and she heard the drill start before she'd reached the end of the street. Miri stood on the road outside her own home and didn't know which direction to walk. Left went into town, right went to the bus station, straight ahead went nowhere in particular. She went to the shelter. It was a concrete building on the edge of town with fluorescent lights and thin mattresses on metal cots. The woman at the front desk was kind but tired. She told Miri she could stay for 2 weeks. After that, she'd need to reapply. There were rules: curfew at 9, no alcohol, no visitors after 7, clean your own area, don't touch other people's things. There were 40 women in the shelter. Some had been there for months, cycling through the 2-week stays, leaving for a day, then reapplying. Some had children with them, little kids who played on the concrete floor and didn't seem to understand why they were there. When Miri's 2 weeks were up and she asked about staying longer, the shelter manager, a man named Carl Briggs, opened a file on his computer and read the regulations line by line. "Mrs. Dalton, we have 22 people waiting for your bed. I can give you 1 more week. After that, you need to be out for at least 24 hours before you can reapply." That's the process. Miri asked, "Where do I go for those 24 hours? Carl looked at her, and in his eyes was not cruelty, but the weariness of a man who had said the same thing to hundreds of women before her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I truly am." Then he closed the file. Miri lay on her cot that first night and stared at the ceiling. The mattress smelled like disinfectant and something else she couldn't place. The fluorescent light buzzed. It never turned off. Someone 2 cots over was crying, quiet and steady, the kind of crying a person does when they've been doing it for so long it doesn't require any effort anymore. Someone else coughed. Near the back wall, a woman whispered a prayer. A child whimpered and then was quiet, soothed by a hand Miri couldn't see in the dim light. She lay there and tried to understand what had happened. Not the facts. She knew the facts. She tried to understand how a life that had seemed permanent, solid, fixed in place could dissolve in 62 days. How you could go from a kitchen with a cracked tile and a husband who fell asleep in front of the television to lying on a cot in a room full of strangers. 1 piece of paper, 1 signature in a trust document, 1 man dying on a Tuesday morning. That was all it took. After the shelter ran out of extensions, Miri took her suitcase and walked to the bus station. Not because she had somewhere to go, because the bus station had a bench and a roof and she could sit there without anyone telling her to move. That's where the handle broke. That's the moment you saw at the very beginning. A woman on her knees gathering clothes, invisible to every person walking past. That was Miriam Dalton, 62 years old, a woman who had held a family together for 35 years, picking up her own underwear off a public sidewalk. For the next 6 days, Miri drifted. There's no other word for it. She slept on benches. She washed her face in public bathrooms with the thin liquid soap that comes from dispensers mounted on tiled walls. She ate at a church that served free meals morning and evening, standing in line with dozens of other people who had nowhere else to eat. The food was simple: rice, beans, sometimes a vegetable. The volunteers who served it were kind. They didn't look at you with pity. They looked at you the way you look at anyone who's hungry. They filled your plate and moved on. She carried her suitcase with a piece of rope tied around it because the handle was gone. The rope cut into her palm by midday, and she'd have to switch hands. She learned things in those 6 days that she'd never known. She learned that public bathrooms and bus stations lock at 10 at night and don't open until 5 in the morning. She learned that sleeping on a bench isn't really sleeping. It's a series of shallow dozes interrupted by sounds, by cold, by the awareness that you're exposed. And she learned that the worst part of being homeless isn't the hunger or the discomfort, it's the invisibility. On the 4th day, Miri got on a bus, not to anywhere specific. She just got on the first bus that had an empty seat because sitting still was killing her, and she needed to move. The bus went north into the mountains. It stopped in small towns she'd never heard of. People got on and off, carrying bags of groceries, sacks of feed children. Mary stayed in her seat and watched the landscape change from flat and dry to green and hilly. The air coming through the windows got cooler. She closed her eyes, and for a few minutes she felt like she was going somewhere, even though she wasn't. On the 6th day, the bus reached the end of its route, a town called Hardin Creek. Mary had never heard of it. The driver turned around and told her this was the last stop. She took her suitcase and stepped down onto a dirt road. Hardin Creek was tiny. A few shops with faded signs, a small coffee shop with 3 plastic chairs out front, a post office that looked like it hadn't been used in years, a handful of houses scattered along the road. Some occupied, some not. Beyond the houses, trees. Dense, thick old trees that climbed up a hillside and disappeared into the kind of green that only exists in places where people have stopped trying to control the landscape. Mary sat at the coffee shop and ordered a cup with the last of her cash. The man running it was old. His hands were steady and his face was weathered and creased by decades of mountain sun. He didn't talk much. His name, she would learn, was Frank Harmon, 82 years old. He'd lived in Hardin Creek his entire life. Mary asked if there was a shelter nearby. He shook his head. She asked if there was anywhere a person could stay for a night. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him making a decision. He pointed toward the trees. He said there was a path up the hill, about 20 minutes walk. At the end of it, there was an old cabin. Nobody had lived in it for years, decades maybe. Some local kids had gone up there once and come back saying it was full of junk and spiders, and it smelled like wet wood. Nobody owned it as far as he knew, or if someone did, they'd long stopped caring. Mary finished her coffee. She looked at the trees. She looked at her broken suitcase. She looked at the road behind her, which led back to a world that had already forgotten she existed. Frank said one more thing before she left. Be careful up there, not because it's dangerous, but that cabin, it has a way of keeping people. He said it like a joke, but his eyes didn't smile. Mary started walking. The path was narrow and overgrown. Roots crossed it like veins under skin. Branches hung low enough that she had to duck every few steps. Her suitcase caught on everything. Twice she had to stop and untangle the rope from a bush. The air changed as she climbed, cooler, damper. She could hear birds she didn't recognize and the faint sound of running water somewhere to her left. Her legs ached. Her lower back throbbed. She was 62 years old and hadn't walked uphill since a family trip 15 years ago. But she kept going because there was no reason to go back. After about 25 minutes, the path opened up into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin sat at the far end of the clearing, like something that had grown out of the ground rather than been built on it. It was small, one story, built from wood that had gone gray with age and weather. The roof sagged in the middle but hadn't collapsed. One window was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The front door was closed but not locked. Weeds had grown up around the foundation so thick that the bottom third of the cabin was almost hidden. A rusted water pump stood a few meters to the right, its handle frozen in the up position. Behind the cabin, the hill continued upward into more trees and shadow. Mary walked to the door and pushed it open. The hinges screamed. Inside, the air was thick and still. Light came through the cracked window in a single gray beam. The floor was wood warped in places, but solid enough that it didn't give when she stepped on it. There was a table, a single chair, a wood stove with a pipe that went up through the ceiling. Against one wall, a narrow bed frame with no mattress, just bare springs sagging in the middle. Shelves lined the opposite wall, and on them sat glass jars with dried contents, tin canisters, a few books with swollen spines, a kerosene lamp with a cracked glass chimney, and a wooden box with a brass latch. Nobody had been here in a very long time. That was clear from the dust alone. Thick gray undisturbed dust on every surface, but here's what struck Miri, and it's important. The place wasn't destroyed. It wasn't vandalized. It wasn't torn apart by weather or animals. It was just stopped. Like whoever lived here had walked out one day and everything had frozen in place. The jars still had dried contents in them. The books were swollen but still upright on the shelf. A pair of rubber boots sat by the door, cracked and gray. A coat hung on a nail behind the door, stiff as cardboard arms, hanging like it was still waiting for someone to put it on. Mary set her suitcase down on the floor. She stood in the middle of that cabin, alone in a town she'd never heard of, at the top of a hill she'd had no reason to climb. And for the first time in weeks, something in her chest loosened. Not joy, not relief exactly, just space. Room to breathe, room to stand without someone telling her when to leave. She looked at the coat hanging behind the door and noticed a button was missing. The second from the top, someone had worn this coat. Someone had reached for it on cold mornings, buttoned it up, and walked outside into these woods. Someone real. And that someone had gone somewhere, or been taken, or something else entirely that Mary didn't yet understand but could feel pressing against the edges of this silent, frozen room. The cabin smelled like a closed mouth. That was Mary's first thought when she woke up on the bare springs, her own clothes bunched beneath her as a makeshift mattress, her spine announcing every coil. The air was thick, undisturbed, the kind of stillness that accumulates over decades when no window has been opened and no voice has filled the space. It tasted like dust and old wood and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. She lay there and listened. The woods outside were louder than she expected. Not the steady background noise of a town, the hum of traffic and televisions leaking through walls, but specific sounds, individual and close. A branch cracking somewhere uphill. Something small and quick moving through dry leaves. A bird she'd never heard before, 3 rising notes repeated at intervals so precise it sounded mechanical. And beneath all of it, the faint rush of water. A stream somewhere to her left, just out of sight. Every sound was amplified by the silence around it. Every creak of the cabin walls made her stiffen. But the walls held. The roof held. The floor, warped and uneven as it was, did not give beneath her when she stood. Whatever this place was, it had been standing through storms and winters and summers for longer than she'd been married. One more night had not broken it, She did not sleep well that first night, but she slept, and that alone was something. In the morning, Mary cleaned, not because she had a plan, not because cleaning would solve anything. She cleaned because that was what she did when the world stopped making sense. When Rob's business was failing and the bills were stacking up, she had cleaned the house until the floor shone. When her mother died 6 years ago, she had driven home from the hospital and scrubbed the kitchen counters until her hands were raw. It was not a strategy. It was a reflex. The body's way of saying, I am still here. I can still do something. She opened the front door and both windows. The cracked one she wedged wider with a stick. Air moved through the cabin for what might have been the first time in years, carrying in the smell of wet earth and pine. She pulled a branch from a bush outside and used it as a broom, sweeping dust and debris and the dried husks of dead insects toward the door. The dust rose in clouds and caught the gray morning light. She tested the water pump. The handle was frozen in the up position, rusted solid, and for the first 7 or 8 tries, it didn't move at all. She wrapped both hands around it and pulled with everything she had, her shoulders burning, her feet bracing against the base. On the 9th try, something inside the mechanism gave way with a metallic groan, and the handle moved. Brown water sputtered out, thick and rust-colored. She kept pumping. The water lightened, turned from brown to yellow, to cloudy to clear, and when it finally ran cold and clean, she cupped her hands under it and drank. It tasted like iron and stone, and it was the best thing she'd had in weeks. It took her 3 days to make the cabin livable. She found a torn blanket in a trunk beneath the bed frame, carried it down the path to the stream she'd been hearing, and washed it against the rocks until the water ran clear. She dragged it back up and hung it over a low branch to dry. She figured out the wood stove after 2 hours of cursing and 3 failed attempts. The chimney pipe was partially blocked, and she had to climb onto a chair and reach up into the flue with a stick to dislodge a clot of old leaves and what might have been a bird's nest. When she finally got a fire going and the stove began to tick and radiate heat, she sat in the chair and felt something she hadn't felt since long before Rob died. Competence, the simple physical satisfaction of solving a problem with her hands. She boiled water and drank it. She made rice on the stove in a dented pot she found in a cabinet beneath the shelves. The rice tasted like nothing, but it filled her stomach. She walked back down to Hardin Creek and spent her last few dollars on more rice salt cooking oil and a box of matches. Frank Harmon didn't ask where she was staying. He didn't ask why. He just rang her up and added a small bag of sugar to the counter without charging for it. She thanked him. He waved her off. That was the extent of their relationship in those first days, and it was enough. It was on the second evening, while she was wiping down the table with a damp cloth, that she found it. She turned the table on its side to clean the legs, and there on the underside of the surface, carved into the wood in small, precise letters, were 2 words and a number. Catherine Ellison, 1973. Miri ran her finger over the carving. The letters were shallow but deliberate. Someone had taken a knife or a nail and pressed each stroke carefully into the grain. Not scratched in a hurry, carved with intention, the way you write your name in something you own. She set the table upright and sat down. She looked at the shelves, the jars, the books with swollen spines, the coat still hanging behind the door with its missing button. She looked at the wooden box with the brass latch. And she understood with a quiet certainty that this cabin had not been abandoned. It had been left. There was a difference. Over the following days, the letters told her who Catherine Ellison was. In the wooden box on the shelf beneath a tangle of rubber bands and a rusted pair of scissors, Miri found a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine. The paper was yellow and fragile at the edges, the kind of paper that crumbles if you grip it too hard. She handled each one like it might dissolve. She read one letter each evening by the light of the kerosene lamp she'd managed to get working. The wick was short, barely half an inch, and the flame guttered whenever the breeze came through the cracked window. But it gave enough light to read by, and the soft orange glow filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Kate Ellison had been the school teacher in Hardin Creek in the early 1970s. She taught children in a one-room schoolhouse near the post office, the same post office that now looked like it hadn't received mail in a decade. She'd bought the land on the hillside with money she'd saved over 10 years of teaching. 10 years of not buying new clothes, not taking vacations, not spending a dollar she didn't absolutely have to spend. A friend's letter made this clear. You did it, Kate. Your own place, your own land. Most women our age can't even imagine it. A sister's letter was more cautious. You can't live alone on a hill forever, Kate. What will people say? But there were other letters, 3 of them with no return address typed on heavy paper, with a company letterhead embossed at the top. Crestline Properties Limited. They referenced a land survey, a reassessment of property boundaries, a development partnership opportunity. The first letter was polite, almost friendly, the tone of a company that assumed cooperation was inevitable and just needed to work out the details. The second was firmer. Words like timeline and compliance appeared. The third letter, dated 1981, dropped all pretense. It was 1 paragraph long and ended with a single typed line that Mary read 3 times. This is our final communication on the matter. Please vacate the premises within 30 days. Mary set that letter down on the table and stared at it. She knew the weight of those words. She knew exactly how they landed on a person. She had received her own version of that sentence spoken aloud in her own kitchen by a man in a pressed shirt who called it family obligations. The language was different. The feeling was identical. A door closing, a floor disappearing. And then at the bottom of the wooden box, beneath all the letters folded in thirds and pressed flat by the weight of everything above it, she found the deed. Heavy paper, official stamps, county seal in faded red. A property deed in the name of Catherine Ellison for 10 acres of land that included the cabin, the clearing, the hillside going all the way down to where the path met the road, and a stretch of woodland to the east. 10 acres. Kate Ellison hadn't just owned the cabin, she'd owned the entire hill. Mary sat back in the chair. The kerosene lamp flickered. Outside, the stream whispered and the trees moved in the dark. She held the deed in both hands and felt the paper's weight. This was not a photocopy, not a draft. This was an original, signed and stamped, and filed, the kind of document that doesn't lie. And the question came obvious and heavy. If Kate owned this land outright with a proper deed and official stamps, why was the cabin empty? Why was the hill abandoned? Where had Kate gone? She folded the deed carefully, slid it into a plastic bag she'd been using for toiletries, and put it inside her suitcase. She tied the suitcase shut with the rope. Then she lay down on her makeshift bed and stared at the ceiling and didn't sleep for a long time. The next morning, she went to see Frank. When Mary said the name, Catherine Ellison, Frank Harmon put down the glass he was drying and did not pick it up again. He stood behind the counter of his small shop with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes focused on something that wasn't in the room. He was quiet for a long time. Then he started talking, and once he started, he didn't stop for nearly 20 minutes. Kate had been a fixture of Hardin Creek in the 1970s. Well-liked, if a little unusual. A single woman living alone on a hill, growing her own vegetables, bringing them down to the weekly market. She wasn't unfriendly. She helped families with paperwork when they needed someone who could navigate the county forms. She read to the older folks at the church on Sundays. But she kept to herself in the way that people do when they've chosen a life that others don't quite understand and have stopped trying to explain it. Around 1979, Crestline Properties started buying land in the area. They were based out of the city, had money, had lawyers, had plans. A resort, a development, something big. Most people sold willingly because the money was good and the land wasn't producing much. But Kate wouldn't sell. Her 10 acres sat right in the middle of the parcel Crestline needed. Without her land, their project had a hole in it. Frank paused here. He picked up the glass again, dried it slowly, set it on the shelf. Then he said what came next very carefully. One day, sometime in late 1982 or early 1983, Kate just wasn't there anymore. Nobody saw her leave, no moving truck, no goodbye. She was there on a Thursday and she wasn't there on a Monday, and by Wednesday people were talking about it, and by the following month the school had hired a replacement teacher, and that was the end of it. The cabin sat on the hill and nobody went up there. Crestline acquired the land through some legal process. By 1985, the deed was in their name. Miri asked the question that had been building in her chest since she'd read the letters. Did anyone report Kate missing? Frank shook his head slowly. No family came looking. No police investigation. No inquiry of any kind. A single woman disappearing from a hill in rural West Virginia in the early 1980s didn't make anyone's priority list. People talked for a while, then they stopped. Then Frank told her who had been running Crestline's local operations back then. A young man barely into his 20s, always trailing after his father. The father was Richard Mercer, the company's founder. The son's name was Preston Mercer, the same man who now ran everything. Frank said one more thing. He said that in the last year of Rob's life, he'd seen Victor Dalton come to the print shop multiple times. Didn't look like visiting, Frank said. Looked like collecting. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Miri understood. The third loan, the one she couldn't trace, the one Victor had been vague about. Rob hadn't borrowed that money for the business. He'd borrowed it for Victor. And Victor had sold her house to pay back money her own husband had taken out on his behalf. She wrote Victor's name in her notebook and drew a line under it. Then she turned to a fresh page. On the walk back from Frank's shop, a patrol car pulled alongside her on the dirt road. It rolled slowly, matching her pace gravel, popping under its tires. The driver's window came down. The man behind the wheel was big, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent suspicion. His uniform shirt was tight across the chest, and his badge caught the afternoon light. Tucker Boggs, Hardin Creek's sheriff, introduced himself without getting out of the car. His questions were specific. Who was she? Where was she staying? How long had she been there, whether anyone knew she was on the property? He asked each one in a tone that was technically polite, but left no space for small talk. Miri answered with her name and nothing else of substance. Tucker looked at her for a moment, then said, "That cabin's on private land, ma'am. I'd advise you to find somewhere else." Miri asked, "Whose private land?" The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. 3 seconds is not a long time in most conversations. It is a very long time when a sheriff is trying to decide how much to say to a woman standing on a dirt road. "Crestline Properties," he said. Then he rolled up the window and drove off. Miri wrote Tucker Boggs in her notebook beneath Victor's name. She did not draw a line under it. She drew a box around it. 3 mornings later, Miri was boiling water on the wood stove when she heard an engine. Not the distant murmur of a vehicle on the road far below. This was close, getting closer, grinding and scraping up the overgrown path. A white SUV broke through the tree line at the edge of the clearing and stopped. The engine idled for a moment, ticking in the quiet air, then shut off. 2 men got out. The first was young, maybe 30, wearing a hard hat and a high-visibility vest. He carried a clipboard and a rolled-up survey map. He looked around the clearing with the calculating gaze of someone estimating square footage. The second man was older, mid-50s, wearing a gray suit that was already stained with mud at the hems. He had the posture of a man who was accustomed to doors being held open for him. He looked at the cabin the way a demolition crew looks at a condemned building, not with hostility, with arithmetic. They hadn't expected anyone to be here. That was immediately clear. The young man saw Miri through the window and stopped mid-stride. He turned to the older man and said something too low to hear through the glass. The older man's expression shifted. Surprise to irritation in about 2 seconds. He walked to the door and knocked. 3 hard raps that shook the frame. Miri opened it. The man said his name was Preston Mercer. He was a senior development director with Crestline Properties. He said it casually, the way a person gives directions to a gas station, routine information. Nothing special, but the name hit Miri like a hand on her sternum. Crestline, the same letterhead on the letters in the the same company that had written vacate the premises 40 years ago, the same family Frank had described. And here they were, standing at the same door. Preston looked past Miri into the cabin. He asked who she was. She told him her name. He asked what she was doing there. She said she was living there. He asked since when. She said about 2 weeks. He nodded the slow nod of a man who isn't listening to the answer, but composing what he's going to say next. Then he delivered it. The land the cabin stood on was owned by Crestline Properties. Had been for over 30 years. The cabin was an unauthorized structure on private land. He was here conducting a preliminary survey for a new project, an eco-resort, the kind of place where people from Washington and New York pay $2,000 a night to sleep near trees and pretend they have discovered simplicity, and he was going to have to ask her to leave. He said ask the way a judge says sentenced. There was no question in it. Miri asked if he had documentation, proof of ownership, something she could review. Preston smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had done this before, who had stood in doorways and delivered notices and watched people fold, and who expected this to end the way it always ended. He said the documentation was with the company's legal department. He pulled a business card from his inside jacket pocket and held it out between 2 fingers. Miri took the card. She looked at it. She looked at the embossed Crestline logo. She looked at Preston's name and title. She looked at the phone number. Then she looked at Preston. And she said something that she had not planned to say, that came out the way truth sometimes does, without permission, at exactly the moment when silence would have been easier and safer and smarter. I've seen the original deed. This land belongs to Catherine Ellison. Preston's smile did not fade. It vanished. It didn't shrink or soften or transition into some other expression. It was there and then it was gone. And what replaced it was something flat and still. The kind of face that covers a scramble happening behind the eyes. He stared at Miri for 3 full seconds, not blinking, not breathing as far as she could tell. 3 seconds of a man hearing a name he was not supposed to hear from a woman who was not supposed to exist. Then he turned to the young man with the clipboard, said something sharp and too quiet for Miri to catch, and they both got back in the SUV. The engine started. They reversed down the path, branches scraping along the doors, and they were gone below the tree line without another word. Miri stood in the doorway and realized her hands were not shaking. She held them out in front of her and looked at them. Steady, her voice had been steady too, she realized. She hadn't planned what she'd said. She hadn't rehearsed it, but she'd said it clearly, and she'd said it while looking directly into the face of a man who had power and money and lawyers and a white SUV and a sheriff who answered his phone calls. Something had changed in her. She couldn't name exactly when it had happened or what it was, But the woman standing in this doorway was not the woman who had knelt on a sidewalk picking up scattered clothes. That woman had been afraid of everything. This woman had already lost everything there was to lose, and that it turns out is a different kind of person entirely. That same afternoon, Frank found her at a shop and told her what he'd seen. 20 minutes after the SUV pulled away from the hill, Tucker Boggs had driven slowly past the shop, looking up toward the tree line where the path began. Not stopping, just looking, then driving on. Frank said it simply. He knows. He always knew. Mary nodded. She was not surprised. 3 days later, she came back from Hardin Creek to find that someone had been inside the cabin. Nothing was missing, but the wooden box was in a different position on the shelf, pushed 3 inches to the left. The letters inside were out of order. She'd arranged them by date. Now they were jumbled, rifled through by hands that weren't careful. They had been looking for the deed. She was certain of it. She'd been carrying it with her everywhere in the plastic bag inside the suitcase lashed to her body with the rope she now used as a strap. It was still there, still safe. But the violation of the cabin, the only space left to her in the world, settled in her stomach and stayed there. The next day, Frank told her 2 strangers had been in town asking about her, who she was, where she came from, whether she had family nearby. Frank had told them nothing, but he told Mary, and his voice was different when he said it, quieter, more careful. These aren't small people, he said. Then Frank said something else. He said, tomorrow morning I'm coming up the hill, bringing my toolbox. Mary told him he didn't have to do that. Frank said, I'm not asking permission. That front step is rotting out and somebody's going to break an ankle. He showed up at 7 the next morning with a hammer, a box of nails, and a 12-gauge shotgun leaning against the inside of his truck bed. He didn't mention the gun. He didn't have to. He carried the toolbox up the path and spent 2 hours replacing the front step and reinforcing the door frame, while Mary boiled water and said nothing and understood perfectly what he was doing. An 82-year-old man with bad knees and a toolbox climbing a hill every morning is not a man who is fixing a step. He is a man who is saying with hammer and nails instead of words that you are not alone. Frank came every day after that. Then Preston came back. And this time he didn't bring the young surveyor. The man who stepped out of the passenger side of the white SUV was big, not tall, big. Thick neck, thick arms, hands like catcher's mitts. He wore a plain dark jacket and stood slightly behind Preston, with his feet apart and his arms at his sides, the posture of a man whose presence was the message. Preston knocked. Mary opened the door. He was different this time. Smoother on the surface, but the smoothness had a chill underneath it, like a frozen lake that looks solid until you step on it. He said he'd done some checking. The land was Crestline property, legally acquired, properly documented. He opened a folder and showed Mary a deed with Crestline's name on it, stamped registered, dated 1985. He said she was trespassing. He said he was giving her formal notice to vacate within 7 days. After that, he said they would involve law enforcement. He said it the way you describe the weather, factual, inevitable. Mary looked at the deed, then she looked at Preston. She took a breath. Where is the newspaper notice for the abandoned property declaration? Preston blinked. Once she saw it. Under state law, abandoned property declarations require published notice in a regional newspaper at least 60 days before auction. There's no record of any notice in the county files. I checked. I went to the records office myself. I sat there for 3 hours while a clerk searched every file she could access. The room was very quiet. The big man shifted his weight from one foot to the other. A board creaked beneath him. Mary was not finished. There's also no police report documenting any search for Catherine Ellison. No missing person report. No inquiry of any kind. A woman disappears from her own property, and the county judge declares the land abandoned without following a single legally required step. And the only bidder at the auction was your company, at a price that wouldn't buy a used truck. She watched Preston's face while she spoke. She watched the smoothness crack, not dramatically, not like a wall falling, but in small ways. A tightening around the mouth, a stillness in the eyes that was not calm but controlled. Preston closed his folder. He looked at Miri with an expression she could not fully read. Then he said very quietly, "You don't know what you're getting into." Miri said, "I think I do." He turned and walked back to the SUV. The big man followed. The engine started. They reversed down the path without a word, and they were gone. That night, Frank stayed late. He sat at the table and drank the coffee Miri made on the wood stove, and neither of them spoke about what was coming. But when he stood to leave, he said, "I'll be back before light." Miri told him to be careful on the path in the dark. He said, "I've been walking in the dark since 1969. He didn't explain what he meant by that, and she didn't ask, but she understood that Frank Harmon was a man who had walked through things far worse than a dirt path on a dark hillside, and that he had chosen at 82 years old to walk through one more. She fell asleep with the door barred and the wooden box under her pillow and the deed strapped to her body beneath her clothes. She woke to the smell of smoke, not wood smoke, not the familiar smell of the stove. This was chemical, thick, acrid, the kind of smoke that burns your throat before it reaches your lungs. She sat up and saw orange light through the window. Wavering, shifting, growing. The woodpile behind the cabin was burning. Someone had doused it with accelerant and lit it, and the flames were already reaching toward the back wall, licking at the old gray boards, finding the dry spots climbing. Miri grabbed her suitcase and the wooden box and ran outside in bare feet. The heat hit her face like an open oven. The back wall was starting to catch, individual boards glowing at the edges, smoke pouring from the seams between them. She ran to the pump. She pumped until her arms went numb, and her shoulders screamed and her palm blistered against the iron handle. She filled the dented pot, ran to the wall, through the water, ran back, pumped, filled, through, again, again. The flames hissed where the water hit but didn't stop. She could feel the heat through the soles of her bare feet on the packed earth. 20 minutes, maybe longer. She lost track. The woodpile burned itself out because there was nothing left to burn. The back wall was scorched and blackened but still standing. The old wood, decades of mountain damp soaked deep into the grain, had resisted the flames just enough. She sat on the ground in front of the cabin, covered in ash, covered in sweat. Her feet were cut from roots and rocks she hadn't seen in the dark. Her hands were raw. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and the night air on her wet skin was cold enough to make her ribs ache. Then she heard footsteps on the path, slow, uneven, labored. A flashlight beam swinging through the trees. Frank Harmon emerged from the darkness 35 minutes after the fire started. He'd seen the glow from below from the shop where he'd been sitting awake, unable to sleep, and he'd climbed the hill in the dark at 82 years old, with bad knees and a flashlight and nothing else. He saw her on the ground. He saw the scorched wall. He didn't say a word. He walked over and sat down beside her on the cold earth in front of the cabin. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small bottle of water and handed it to her. Miri drank. That was the entire conversation. Two old people sitting in the dark in front of a burned wall, passing a bottle of water between them, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. In the morning, Miri called Nadia Farouk from Frank's phone. Nadia told her three things. Photograph everything. File a police report. And do not leave the cabin, because the moment she left, they would demolish it and claim it was an unsafe structure, and every piece of evidence inside it would disappear with the rubble. Mary went to the sheriff's station to file the report. Tucker Boggs took it himself. He wrote slowly, asked few questions, and did not meet her eyes. When Mary described the chemical smell, the accelerant, Tucker wrote, "Source undetermined," on the report form. Mary leaned forward and said, "Accelerant, right, accelerant." Tucker looked at her for the first time directly, and something passed between them, a recognition that they both knew exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible, and that this report would sit in a drawer and gather dust. He wrote the word, he signed the form, he handed her the receipt and said, "We'll look into it." His voice was flat as pavement. Mary took the receipt and left. She did not need Tucker. She needed paper. She needed a record that existed in the system, time-stamped, signed undeniable. Tucker's inaction was expected. His signature was enough. Dylan Russo arrived the day after the fire. He was thin and intense, carrying a bag that was more camera and voice recorder than anything else. He'd been covering Crestline properties for over a year, following a pattern he'd noticed in their land acquisitions across multiple counties: rural properties, individual owners, single bidder auctions. He'd been looking for a case where the original owner could be identified and the trail could be followed. Now he had one. He sat in the cabin with Miri for 2 hours. He read every letter. He photographed every document, front and back, with a camera that clicked and flashed in the lamplight. He recorded Frank's account of Kate's disappearance word for word at the stump below. He walked the property, measuring the clearing, noting the position of the cabin relative to the road. He photographed the burn marks on the front wall from 6 different angles. He took samples of the charred wood in small plastic bags. He knelt close to the wall and sniffed and wrote 2 words in his notebook: petroleum-based. Then he came back inside. He stood near the bed frame and looked at the floor. He was quiet for a moment, studying the planks, his head tilted slightly. Then he knelt down and pointed. "Have you looked under the floorboards?" Miri hadn't. She'd cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, swept every surface, organized every object. But she hadn't thought to look beneath. Dylan pointed to a plank near the bed frame that was slightly shorter than the others. Its edge was worn smooth in a way that suggested it had been lifted many times by careful fingers. He worked his fingertips under the edge and pried it up. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth that was still intact after 4 decades, was a metal box. The kind you'd buy at a hardware store to keep important papers safe from moisture. Dylan lifted it out and set it on the table. Inside were 3 things: a diary, a second notarized copy of the land deed identical to the one Miri had found in the wooden box, and a letter from Kate Ellison to her sister Dorothy dated November 1982. The letter had never been mailed. Miri read it aloud. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Kate wrote that she was afraid. Men had come to the cabin twice that week. They stood in the clearing at the edge of the trees and watched. They didn't approach. They didn't speak. They just stood there, 2 of them, hands in their pockets, looking at her windows. She'd heard that the county judge had been seen having dinner with Crestline's people at a restaurant in the next town over. She'd hidden copies of her documents beneath the floorboard because she was not foolish, and she knew what these men were capable of. "I am not going to sell," Kate wrote, "and I am not going to leave. But if something happens to me, I want you to know the truth. I want someone to know." The diary was worse. Months of escalation recorded in Kate's small, precise handwriting. Strangers on her property at odd hours. Her vegetable garden destroyed overnight, every plant pulled up by the roots. The school principal pulling her aside after class and telling her in a voice that was careful and not quite his own that certain people were unhappy. A dead raccoon left on her front step, its body arranged deliberately facing the door. The entries grew shorter as the months went on. Less description, more fear. Single sentences by the end. The final entry was dated December 3rd, 1982. Two men at the door today. They said I have 48 hours. I don't know what they'll do, but I'm not leaving. Nothing after that. The next page was blank. And the page after that, and every page after that, all the way to the back cover. The diary simply ended midlife, mid-sentence, almost like a recording that cuts to static. The cabin was silent. Nobody spoke. Dylan sat across from Mary with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set. Mary stared at the blank page that followed Kate's last words. The lamp flickered. Then the sound of footsteps on the front step. Nadia Farouk ducked through the doorway. She'd driven 3 hours from the district office after Dylan called her. She was breathing hard from the climb. Her shoes were caked with mud. She dropped her bag on the floor, looked at the documents spread across the table, and read everything. Every letter, every diary entry, every line of the unmailed letter. 40 minutes, no interruptions. When she was done, she stood up. She looked at Mary, then at Dylan, then at the charred back wall visible through the open rear window. She said 3 words. We have enough. She was already building the legal case in her head. Mary could see it the way Nadia's eyes moved from document to document, connecting dates, cross-referencing names, assembling a timeline that stretched across 4 decades. Fraud, criminal intimidation, illegal seizure of property. And beneath all of it, darker than any legal term, would capture the disappearance of a woman who had written, "I'm not leaving," and then was never seen again. But Nadia was also pursuing something she hadn't told Mary yet. Something she'd found in the county records that didn't match the story of a woman who simply vanished. A name on a church donation list in Vermont dated 2019. A sister named Dorothy living in Pennsylvania who might still be alive. A thread so thin it could snap at a touch. But if Dorothy knew something, then the question that had been hanging over this cabin since Mary first pushed open the door might have an answer that no one expected. Kate Ellison might not be a ghost. She might not be a name carved under a table and a story that ended on a blank page. She might still be alive. Nadia found Dorothy Ellison on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, 3 weeks after the fire. The thread she'd been following, the one that started with a name on a church donation list in Vermont and led to a post office box in rural Pennsylvania, did not snap. It held. And at the end of it was a 79-year-old woman sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of a farmhouse outside of Lancaster, who had been waiting for this phone call for longer than Nadia could comprehend. Dorothy did not speak for the first 2 minutes of the call. Nadia later told Mary that she could hear the old woman breathing steady and controlled the breath of someone who was trying very hard not to break apart. When Dorothy finally spoke, her voice was thin and precise, like thread pulled through a needle. She said, "I knew someone would call eventually. I just didn't think it would take this long." Dorothy had discovered that Kate was alive 5 years earlier. A chain of coincidences that started with a church bulletin in Brattleboro, Vermont, where a volunteer had published a list of donors for a winter clothing drive. One of the names on the list was Catherine Ellis, not Catherine Ellison. Close enough that when Dorothy's granddaughter saw it while visiting friends in New England and mentioned it offhandedly at Thanksgiving dinner, Dorothy went still in her chair and didn't touch her food for the rest of the meal. She'd traveled to Vermont alone, telling no one, and found her sister living in a Quaker community on the outskirts of town. Kate had been there since January 1983. She'd arrived in the dead of winter wearing a nightgown and no shoes, her feet wrapped in a plastic bag she'd found at a gas station. She'd given a false name. She'd worked in the kitchen, the garden, the laundry. She had spoken to almost no one for the first 5 years. Gradually over decades, she'd built a life so small and so quiet that it was nearly invisible, which was exactly the point. Dorothy had begged her to come home. Kate had refused. She said 5 words that Dorothy repeated now to Nadia in a voice that had not lost its horror after 5 years. "They'll kill me this time." Dorothy had kept the secret. She'd visited once a year, always alone, always telling her family she was going to see a friend. She'd watched her sister age in a community of strangers, tending other people's gardens and cooking other people's meals. And she carried the weight of knowing and not telling until Dylan Russo's article appeared in the Ridgeline Gazette, and a volunteer from a women's advocacy group showed it to her in a coffee shop in Lancaster. Dorothy read the article. She read about a woman named Miriam Dalton who had found a cabin on a hill and the documents inside it, and who had stood in the doorway and spoken Kate's name to the man who wanted her erased. Dorothy set the newspaper down on the table and pressed both hands flat against it as if the paper might blow away, as if the story might disappear the way her sister had. Then she told them everything. When they reached Kate by phone at the Quaker community in Vermont, the woman on the line spoke in a voice that was quiet but clear. There was no hysteria, no dramatic pauses, no wavering. It was the voice of someone who had carried a story inside her body for 40 years, the way a person carries a stone in a coat pocket, always present, always heavy, so familiar that you forget you're carrying it until someone asks you to set it down. In December 1982, 3 men came to the cabin at night. It was cold. She had been asleep. She heard the front door being kicked, not knocked on, kicked, and the wood around the lock splintered inward. Before she could get out of bed, 2 of them were inside. One grabbed her by the arm and pulled her upright. The other picked up the kerosene lamp from the table, the same lamp Miri had been reading by every evening for weeks, and held it close to the wall. He said, "This place goes up easy." The third man stood in the doorway. She could not see his face against the dark behind him. He was the one who talked. He told her she had 2 choices: leave now, or leave later in a way that would be much worse. He did not use the word kill. He didn't need to. The man holding the lamp tilted it slightly, and a thin line of kerosene ran down the wall and pooled on the floor. Kate understood. They drove her to a bus station 2 towns away and left her on the concrete with $20 and the nightgown she'd been sleeping in. No shoes, no coat, no documents. 2 in the morning, the temperature near freezing. She sat on a bench until the first bus came at 5. She got on it without looking at the destination. She rode until it stopped and got on another one and rode again. She ended up in Vermont because she had once heard that Quaker communities took people in without questions. She arrived with nothing and became no one. For 40 years, she had tended gardens and washed dishes and meditated in silence, and never once forgotten the cabin, the hill, the clearing, the flowers she'd planted along the front wall. She had never stopped being angry. She had simply learned to carry the anger the way you carry something breakable, carefully close to the body, never setting it down because you're afraid that if you do, it will shatter and cut you. When Nadia explained what Miri had done, every step of it, finding the documents facing Preston Mercer, surviving the fire, building the legal case from a notebook and a stack of yellowed letters, Kate was quiet on the phone for a very long time. So long that Nadia checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Then Kate said in a voice that had 40 years of waiting compressed into 4 words, "Tell her I'm coming back." Miri was sitting on the bench outside Frank's shop when Nadia called to tell her. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When Nadia finished, Miri set the phone down on the bench beside her and looked at the road and the trees and the hill rising above the town, and she cried in a way she hadn't cried since the morning she signed the papers at the hospital after Rob died. This was not the quiet, automatic crying of the shelter where tears were background noise. This was different. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere she hadn't been able to reach through the weeks of concrete benches and chemical soap and the buzz of fluorescent lights. Relief and grief and fury, and something she couldn't name, all arriving at the same time, all demanding the same space. Frank came out of the shop carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one beside her on the bench. He sat down. He put his hand on her arm once briefly, the way a person touches something fragile to check if it's still intact. Then he picked up his own cup and drank and said nothing, because he was a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can do for another person is to sit next to them and be quiet. Dylan's article ran the following week. Front page of the Ridgeline Gazette. It was not just about Hardin Creek. It was about 3 other towns in the region where Crestline Properties had acquired land through the same process. Farmers who refused to sell and then disappeared. Properties declared abandoned without the required legal steps. Single bidder auctions that had prices so low they constituted their own evidence. A pattern stretching back decades, operating in plain sight in small towns where no one was watching and no one was asking questions. The story went national within days. A television crew from a network affiliate drove to Hardin Creek and filmed the cabin and the scorched wall and the path up the hill. Dylan did 3 radio interviews in 1 week. The Ridgeline Gazette's website, which normally received a few hundred visits a month, crashed twice from the traffic. Tucker Boggs resigned 6 days after the article was published. Dylan had found buried in publicly available tax filings that no one had bothered to examine that Tucker had been receiving $800 a month from Crestline Properties for 12 years, listed as a security consulting fee. Tucker did not hold a press conference. He did not issue a statement. He simply stopped showing up at the station, and a week later his house was empty and a for sale sign stood in the yard. No one in Hardin Creek expressed surprise. Several people expressed relief. Nadia filed an expanded petition with the county court. Fraud, criminal intimidation, illegal seizure of property, the unexplained disappearance of a property owner. Crestline's lawyers, a team of 3 from a firm in Washington, D.C., fought to dismiss. They argued the transfer was decades old. They said Kate had simply relocated. Statute of limitations, they said. Case closed. Judge Margaret Chen assigned to the case after 2 other judges recused themselves due to potential conflicts of interest. Read the diary entries in open court. She read the unmailed letter. She read the final entry, December 3rd, 1982, and the blank pages that followed it. She looked at Crestline's legal team over the top of her glasses and said, "You want me to believe a woman who wrote 'I'm not leaving' simply left?" She ordered a full investigation. She denied every motion to dismiss. She set a trial date. The day Kate Ellison walked into the courtroom was something the people of that county talked about for years afterward. The gallery was packed. There were journalists from 3 national newspapers, a camera crew from a cable news channel, and roughly 100 local residents who had driven from Hardin Creek and the surrounding towns. Some of them remembered Kate, most didn't, but they all knew the story now, and they had come to see the woman at the center of it. She was small, thin. Her hair was completely white and pulled back from her face the same way it had been in the photograph from 1973, the one Miri had found in the drawer, and had since framed and hung on the cabin wall. She used a cane. She moved slowly, one deliberate step at a time, but she walked in under her own power. When the court usher offered his arm, she shook her head once firmly and kept walking. She sat down in the witness chair with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at the courtroom the way she had once looked at her clearing from the cabin door, taking it all in, measuring it, claiming it. Crestline's lead counsel, a man named Douglas Webb, who wore a suit that cost more than most people in the gallery earned in a month, adjusted his tie. He'd been briefed. He knew the case was deteriorating. He also knew that cross-examining an 83-year-old woman who had survived 40 years in hiding was not a situation that ended well for the person asking the questions, regardless of what she said. Judge Chen asked Kate to tell her story in her own words at her own pace. Kate spoke for 45 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She described buying the land with 10 years of savings. She described building the cabin, hiring a carpenter from town, digging the foundation, alongside him carrying lumber up the hill on her own back. She described the years of teaching the children, the satisfaction of coming home to a place that was entirely hers. Then her voice dropped half a register, not softer but denser, and she described the crestline letters, the strangers appearing on her property, the escalation. Her garden pulled up overnight, the dead animal on her doorstep, the school principal taking her aside and choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. The night the three men came, the kicked door, the kerosene on the wall, the drive to the bus station, the $20 and the nightgown and the freezing concrete. When she was finished, the courtroom was so quiet that Mary, sitting in the third row, could hear the ceiling fan turning overhead. Webb stood up. He straightened his papers. He buttoned his jacket. He asked Kate one question. Miss Ellison, if these events truly occurred as you describe, why did you not go to the police? Kate looked at him. She did not look angry. She did not look intimidated. She looked at him with an expression of such plain, undramatic clarity that it was worse than anger. Because the police were with them, she said. The judge was with them. The county clerk was with them. Everyone who was supposed to protect me was being paid by the people who wanted my land. She paused, not for effect, because she was deciding whether to say the last part. Where exactly was I supposed to go? Webb sat down. He had no follow-up questions. The silence in the gallery lasted long enough for Mary to hear someone behind her exhale. Mary was called as a witness on the third day of the trial. She took the bus to the courthouse, walked through the metal detectors, sat on a wooden bench in the hallway for 2 hours, and then walked in and sat down in the witness chair. She described finding the cabin. She described the letter, the deed, the wooden box. She described Preston Mercer's first visit, his words, the way his face had changed when she said Kate's name. She described the second visit, the man with the thick neck, the 7-day notice. She described coming home to find the cabin searched. She described the fire. She was calm. She was precise. Dates, times, locations. She'd been preparing for this in her notebook for months. Nadia barely had to prompt her. Webb stood for cross-examination. He did not challenge the facts. He challenged Mary's standing. He called her a drifter, a woman with no legal right to be on the property. He suggested she had manufactured a story to avoid eviction. He asked whether she'd been paying rent, whether she had authorization to be there, whether she understood that occupying someone else's property without permission was in fact a crime. Mary looked at him. She let the question settle. Then she said, I was a woman with nowhere to go who walked into a cabin and found evidence of a crime your client has been profiting from for 40 years. If that makes me a vagrant, then I'm the most useful vagrant you've ever met. The gallery laughed. Judge Chen pressed her lips together in a way that might have been a smile. Webb sat down. Then something happened that no one expected. Not Nadia, not Dylan, not Webb, not even, it seemed, his own attorneys. Preston Mercer asked to speak. His defense lawyer objected, immediately standing up and leaning toward his client with a look of controlled panic. Preston waved him off. Judge Chen studied Preston for a moment, then allowed it. Preston stood. He did not look at Kate. He looked at the table in front of him, at his own hands resting on its surface. He was quiet for several seconds, and in those seconds, the courtroom held its breath. He said that his father, Richard Mercer, founder of Crestline Properties, who had died in 2001, was the person who had ordered Kate Ellison removed from her property in December 1982. Preston had been 13 years old at the time. He had not been present that night, but he had heard his father on the phone the following morning speaking to someone whose name he did not know, saying 5 words that Preston had carried with him for 4 decades, the way Kate had carried her anger and Mary had carried her suitcase close to the body, never setting it down. It's done, she's gone. Preston said he had grown up knowing what his father had built and how he had built it. He said he had spent his entire career maintaining the structure, the holdings, the reputation, the legal architecture that kept the past buried. He said he was not confessing out of remorse. His lawyer had advised him that cooperation would be taken into consideration at sentencing. He was in the end his father's son, practical to the last. But then he listed 7 other land acquisitions that Crestline had conducted using the same methods: intimidation, forced removal, fraudulent abandonment declarations, single bidder auctions, 7 cases, 4 of them unknown to anyone in the room until that moment. Names, dates, locations, each one landing in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Kate, still seated in the gallery where she had remained after her testimony, said something so quietly that only Mary 2 seats away heard it. 13 years old, he was 13. Mary could not tell whether it was judgment or pity. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps at 83, after 40 years of silence and hiding and carrying something that should have destroyed her, Kate Ellison had arrived at a place where judgment and pity were no longer separate things but 2 sides of the same exhausted recognition that harm travels through generations like water through rock, and the people who inherit it are damaged too, just differently. The ruling came 8 days later, 27 pages. Judge Chen dismantled every element of the 1984 property transfer with the precision of a watchmaker taking apart a broken mechanism. The land had never been legally abandoned because Kate had never left voluntarily. The newspaper notice required by law had never been published. The police search required by law had never been conducted. The auction had been conducted with a single bidder at a price the judge called so far below market value as to constitute evidence of collusion on its face. The transfer was declared void. The land was restored to Catherine Ellison. Crestline Properties was ordered to pay restitution, back taxes on the property they had been holding illegally for 4 decades, and all legal costs. The criminal aspects, the intimidation, the forced removal, the fraudulent declarations, the collusion of county officials, were referred to the state attorney general's office for prosecution. Preston Mercer was arrested 2 days after the ruling at the airport trying to board a flight. Ray Kendrick, the retired county judge who had signed the fraudulent abandonment declaration in 1984, was charged with misconduct and fraud. His pension was revoked. 3 other former county officials who had processed the paperwork were named in the criminal referral. Preston was convicted and sentenced to 5 years. Not enough, Nadia said, for what he had done for the fear, for the 40 years Kate had spent in hiding for the fire that had nearly destroyed the evidence and the woman protecting it. But it was the system, imperfect and slow and groaning under its own weight, finally doing what it was supposed to do. Dylan's investigative series won a National Journalism Award. 4 more land transfers in other counties were challenged in court by original owners or their descendants who came forward after reading his articles. An 80-year-old farmer in the next county discovered that land he'd been told was seized for a government road project in 1991 had actually been sold to Crestline through the same process. He got his land back. The state ordered a comprehensive review of all abandoned property declarations in the region, going back 30 years. Nadia was appointed to the review committee. The eco-resort was never built. Kate came to Hardin Creek for the first time in 40 years on a morning in early spring. The air was cool and clean, and the hillside was bright with new growth. Mary waited for her at the bottom of the path. She'd been there since 7, too restless to stay in the cabin, and had walked down in the pre-dawn gray, tripping twice on routes she knew by heart now, but couldn't see in the half-light. The government sedan that Nadia had arranged pulled up on the road. The back door opened. Kate stepped out, slowly steadying herself against the frame with one hand and gripping her cane with the other. She was smaller than Miri had expected from the photograph, thinner. Her face was deeply lined, mapped with decades of sun and silence, and her hands trembled slightly as she released the car door. But her eyes were exactly what Miri had seen in the black and white image, sharp, attentive, missing nothing. Kate looked at the hill. She looked at the trees and the path disappearing upward into the green. She stood completely still for a long time, not frozen, absorbing, taking in the fact that this place still existed, that the shape of the land had not changed, that the trees were taller and the path more overgrown, but the hill itself was the same hill she had walked every day for more than a decade. It had been here the entire time, through the men and the threats and the kerosene and the bus station and the 4 decades of silence. The hill had not moved. Mary walked over. She had spent weeks thinking about what to say. She had composed sentences in her head, formal and heartfelt, about admiration and courage and justice. She had imagined clasping Kate's hand and delivering some perfect phrase that would capture everything that had happened and everything it meant. But when she stood in front of Kate and looked at her, 83 years old and 5 feet tall, and holding a cane and trembling slightly in the morning air, all of that fell away. She took Kate's hand, which was cool and dry and stronger than it looked, and she said, "The pump still works." Kate laughed, a small, dry sound, sudden and startling, like a match striking after years in a drawer. Something catching, something waking up. She held Mary's hand and did not let go, and they walked up the path together, slowly stopping every few meters so Kate could catch her breath. Kate touched the trees as they climbed. She ran her fingers along bark that had been saplings the last time she'd been here. She stopped at one point and pointed to a stone at the edge of the path that had a mark scratched into its surface, a small X. She said she'd carved it in 1970, a trail marker in case she ever lost her way coming home in the dark. She'd never needed it, but she'd made it anyway. When they reached the clearing and Kate saw the cabin, she stopped walking entirely. The scorched back wall still dark from the fire. The new timber brace Miri had wedged under the sagging roof. The weeds, the cracked window, and the garden Miri had started, tomato plants staked with sticks, coriander growing in a row, and marigolds along the front of the cabin, just beginning to bud bright spots of orange and gold against the old gray wood. Kate stood in the clearing and looked at it all. It was not the cabin she had left. It was smaller than she remembered, she said later, and sadder. 40 years of neglect had taken their toll. But it was standing, and someone, a stranger, a woman who had walked up this hill with a broken suitcase and no reason to be here, except that every other place in the world had closed its doors, had lit the stove and swept the floor and planted flowers along the front wall, in the same spot where Kate had planted her own flowers half a century ago. Kate looked at Mary with an expression that Mary would think about for the rest of her life. It was not gratitude. Gratitude is what you feel when someone does you a favor. This was something else. Recognition. The look of one person seeing another person who understands what it costs to lose everything and still be standing. Not standing triumphantly, not standing proudly, just standing upright, present, refusing to disappear. "You fixed the stove," Kate said. "First thing," said Mary. They went inside. Kate sat down at the table and ran her hands over the surface, feeling the grain of the wood the way Mary had done on her first day. Her fingers found the spot where she had carved her name 53 years earlier. She traced the letters slowly, K, a T, H, E, R, I, N, E. Each one a small reunion with a version of herself that had been young and stubborn, and absolutely certain that this place was worth 10 years of savings and a lifetime of solitude. Mary made tea on the wood stove. The kettle, a new one that Frank had carried up the hill the previous week, whistled. She poured 2 cups. They drank in silence. Outside, the clearing was bright with morning light, and the trees moved in a slow breeze, and a bird was calling from somewhere in the canopy, 3 rising notes, the same bird Mary had been hearing since her first night here. Frank came up the path 30 minutes later, breathing hard, carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of sugar. He stepped through the doorway and saw Kate sitting at the table. 2 people who had last seen each other 40 years ago when he was a middle-aged man running a shop and she was a young teacher buying supplies for her cabin. They looked at each other across the small room, across the decades, and Frank said, "Your hair went white." Kate said, "So did yours." Frank sat down. Mary poured him a cup. 3 people in a cabin built for one drinking tea and coffee in the morning light, and nobody saying much because everything that needed saying had already been said in courtrooms and phone calls and police reports and newspaper articles and the quiet of 2 women holding hands on a dirt path. Kate told them after a long silence that she wanted to give Mary 5 of the 10 acres. The cabin, the clearing, the path down to the road. She said it the way you offer someone a cup of tea, simply without ceremony, as a fact rather than a gesture. This land had been stolen once. She was not going to let it become something people fought over again. She wanted it in the hands of someone who would take care of it, someone who understood what it was worth, not the money. The other thing, the thing that couldn't be appraised or assessed or written on a deed, the fact that it was a place, a real place, a place where a person could stand and say, "I am here. This is mine. Nobody is going to take it from me." Mary said she couldn't accept. It was too much. She didn't deserve it. Kate looked at her with those sharp, steady eyes and said very quietly, "I didn't ask if you deserved it. I said I'm giving it to you. There's a difference." And that was the end of that conversation. Nadia drew up the transfer papers. Mary signed them at the table, the same table where Kate had carved her name in 1973. Kate signed as the grantor. Frank served as witness. He signed his name slowly and carefully, pressing the pen hard into the paper, and then looked up and asked if there was any more tea. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt. Not just the cabin, everything. Dorothy came from Pennsylvania and stayed for a month. She was 79 and her knees were bad, and the path required 4 stops on the way up. But she made the climb every morning because she was not going to let a hill stand between her and her sister for one more day. 3 women in a cabin designed for 1 person. They slept on makeshift beds. They bumped into each other in the small kitchen area. They argued about how to arrange the shelves and whether the table should go against the wall or in the center of the room. Dorothy said the center. Kate said the wall. Mary said nothing and moved it to the center when Kate wasn't looking. It did not feel crowded. It felt like what it was, a home. Grace sent money from London, and this time it was enough. Enough to hire a carpenter from Hardin Creek named Raju to replace the scorched back wall with fresh timber. Enough to fix the sagging roof with new beams. enough to replace the cracked window with proper glass, enough to buy a real mattress, which Mary carried up the hill on her back because the path was too narrow for a cart. And by the time she reached the top, she was laughing so hard at the absurdity of it. A 62-year-old woman hauling a queen-size mattress up a mountain that she had to sit down in the clearing and wait until she could breathe again. Frank came up one afternoon with a new kettle and a second bag of sugar. He stood in the doorway and looked at the three women rearranging furniture and said the shop wasn't the same without Miri coming in every morning, looking like she'd fought the hill and lost. Miri said she'd still come every day. He said he knew she would. Neil and Donna drove down from Northern Virginia with the baby on a Saturday. Neil carried his daughter in a sling up the path and arrived at the top red-faced and out of breath. He walked into the cabin and looked around. The wood stove, the shelves with Kate's old books and Miri's notebook and the framed photograph, the new window, the table in the center of the room. He sat down and was quiet for a long time. Donna stood in the doorway with the baby on her hip, looking out at the clearing and the trees and the open sky. Neil said, "Mom, this is actually really nice." Miri told him to wait for the sunset. It came around 6:30. The evening light through the west-facing window entered the cabin at a low angle and turned everything gold. The table, the shelves, the walls, Kate's white hair, the baby's face, the whole room filled with warm amber light that lasted about 20 minutes and then slowly faded as the sun dropped below the ridge. Neil stood there holding his daughter and watching the light and not speaking. Donna moved closer to him and put her hand on his back. Miri watched them from the chair by the stove, and she knew that her son understood. Because it was the same light, the same quality, the same warmth, the same gold that had come through the west-facing window of her old kitchen in the house where she'd lived for 35 years. The house with the cracked tile and the front door that clicked, and the husband who fell asleep in front of the television. Different window, different walls, different life, same light, as if the sun had followed her here across all those miles and all those months and all that loss, and had found a way to give her back the one thing she had missed most without knowing she was missing it. One evening, not long after, as the light was fading and the clearing was going blue and quiet, Kate asked Miri if she was happy. Miri thought about it. Not quickly, not with a ready answer, but seriously, the way you think about a question that matters too much for a casual response. She looked at the garden and the peas and the pump handle catching the last of the daylight and the marigolds glowing against the gray wood. Then she said, "I don't know if happy is the right word, but I'm here. I know why I'm here. Tomorrow I'll wake up and the pump will work and the stove will light and there'll be something growing outside. That's enough." Kate nodded slowly. "That's more than enough." They sat together as the last light left the clearing and the trees darkened and the first stars appeared over the hill. Neither of them moved to go inside. The air was cool but not cold. Somewhere in the woods, an owl started calling low and steady, a sound that had been there every night since Miri arrived, but that she only now heard clearly because she was finally still enough to listen. In the mornings, a routine settled over the cabin that had less the feel of a schedule and more the feel of a rhythm, something natural and unhurried like the stream running down the hillside or the birds cycling through their calls at dawn. Kate would wake first because she slept lightly and had for decades, and she'd sit at the table with a book and wait for Miri to start the stove. Miri would make tea. They'd drink it. Kate would go outside to sit in the clearing and read while Miri worked in the garden. They'd eat lunch together, simple food, rice and vegetables from the garden, and whatever Miri had carried up from Frank's shop. In the afternoons, they'd talk sometimes about the case, which was still unwinding through the courts as the state attorney general's investigation expanded, sometimes about their lives. Kate talked about the Quaker community, about the strange piece of living somewhere where nobody expected anything of you. Mary talked about the printing shop, about the small satisfactions of managing inventory and balancing ledgers, and knowing at the end of each day that the numbers matched. They discovered without surprise that they understood each other, not because their lives had been the same, they hadn't, but because they had both arrived at the same knowledge through different roads, that the things you build your identity around, your house, your name, your place in a community, can be taken from you in an afternoon. And what remains after the taking, the part that is still standing when everything else is gone, is the only part that was ever truly yours. Nadia visited once a month. She'd bring updates about the investigation, about the other cases surfacing across the state, about the policy changes working their way through the legislature. She'd sit at the table and eat whatever Mary had cooked and tell them about other women she was helping, other land disputes, other people pushing back against systems that had been taking from them for years. Mary would listen and nod and sometimes open her notebook and point to something she'd noticed in a document, a discrepancy in a date, or a signature that didn't match, because she had become, through necessity and instinct and 35 years of managing books, remarkably good at knowing which papers mattered and which didn't. Nadia once said, half joking, that Mary should go to law school. Mary said she was 62 and her knees hurt from climbing the hill. Nadia said the best lawyer she knew had worse knees. Spring came fully. The clearing filled with green so vivid it looked artificial. Mary's garden expanded on the south side of the cabin, where the sun hit longest. Tomatoes, green beans, spinach, okra, a row of eggplants that Kate had requested, and marigolds along the entire front of the cabin, now orange and gold against the fresh timber of the new back wall. The marigolds had been Kate's idea. She said they kept certain insects away. Whether that was true or not, they looked like small celebrations blooming against the wood in the morning light. Every morning, Mary walked down the path to Hardin Creek for supplies. She'd stop at Frank's shop and sit and drink a cup of coffee, and they'd watch the road together in comfortable silence. Every evening she walked back up. Her legs had grown strong. The steep section that had left her gasping on her first climb was just a part of the walk, now unremarkable, automatic. She stopped thinking about it as exercise. It was just a walk home. One morning, Mary stood at the cabin door and looked out at everything. The tomatoes coming in red and heavy on the vine, the marigolds in full bloom, the pump handle clean and bright where her daily grip had worn away the rust. The path winding down through the trees to a town that had become hers in the way that places become yours, not through ownership papers, but through presence, through showing up every day until the place learns your face and you learn its rhythms. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, kneeling on concrete, invisible, picking up her own clothes off a public sidewalk while the world walked past. She thought about how she had believed for 35 years that her life was that house, that kitchen, that routine, that without those things she was nothing. A woman defined entirely by the structure around her. She had been wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. Her life was not the house. It was not the kitchen. It was not any of the things she had spent decades maintaining and organizing and holding together. Her life was what she did when all of that was gone. It was the walk up the hill with a broken suitcase and no reason to keep climbing except that going back was worse. It was the hand on the pump pulling until the water ran clear. It was the words she had spoken to a man in a gray suit who thought he could frighten her into leaving. It was the notebook, every page filled with dates and names and facts that had dragged a 40-year crime into the light. It was the chair at the table where two women sat and drank tea and did not need to explain anything to each other because they had both survived the same kind of storm and come out the other side standing. The cabin stood behind her, solid, scarred, repaired, still standing. Just like her, Mary picked up her cup. She walked outside and sat down in the chair that Kate had placed in the clearing, angled to face the valley below and the ridge beyond it. She drank her tea. The morning was cool and the birds were loud, and somewhere down the hill, Frank was opening his shop and boiling water and not talking to anyone, which was exactly how he liked it. It was all things considered a good morning. And tomorrow there would be another one.